Let's talk about the dependent uses of the subjunctive voice. This is to say that the clause is dependent on another part of the sentence to stand. It cannot stand on its own as its own sentence. That would be an independent use, which we'll talk about later. These dependent uses of the subjunctive are usually set up by an ut or a ne. This is not always the case, as we'll talk about in a little while, but traditionally is. When you're translating an ut, the best way to translate it is so that, or in order that, or for the purpose that. Something along the lines of that. If you just want to use the word that is also fine. Any way that shows it's a new clause that's set up dependently from the last clause. And ne is the opposite of ut. So the same way that if you wanted to say sum I am as a positive, and you wanted to say I am not, you would say non sum. Instead of non ut, most of the time it's just going to be ne. I've created a flowchart so that you can identify what type of dependent use of the subjunctive is in the sentence, with only a few indicators. Let's start at the top of the chart. A result clause shows the reasoning behind something happening. In Latin, these are almost always set up by the words tam sic ita tantus, or something that means so great or so much. For example, that was so much fun that I fell asleep early. In that sentence, the so much shows why. The reasoning, therefore, the result of that action is that you fell asleep early. The subjunctive comes into play in the dependent section. The independent part of that sentence is I had so much fun. That is a standalone sentence. That is not the part of the subjunctive. I had so much fun that I fell asleep early. The that I fell asleep early cannot stand alone. And yes, you could take off the that and say I fell asleep early as a sentence. But that's not what we're talking about. The clause is that I fell asleep early, which is dependent upon the first clause. It shows the reasoning and the result behind it because we had a so much. Therefore, you would use a subjunctive for the verb falling asleep early. Another thing to note about a result clause is that for a negative, you would use ut non instead of ne. So, for example, if you wanted to say, I had so much fun that I did not fall asleep late, that would be an ut non instead of a ne. The next type of dependent use of the subjunctive is an indirect question. A direct question is a sentence like, how are you? It is a sentence that is meant to be spoken to someone with a question mark that gets you a direct answer. Fine. An indirect question adds a layer to this. For example, he asked why you were sleeping. That actually isn't a question. It is a sentence. The question would be, why are you sleeping? However, that's not what it says. The full sentence is, he asked why you were sleeping. That is an example of an indirect question. The same way that an indirect statement is a he said, she said, he thought, something like that, that is going to be the same case as an indirect question. Except for, instead of having an infinitive now, we have a subjunctive. In an indirect question, you're going to have some form of a question word. He asked why. Now, it's important to note that asking alone does not make it an indirect question. For example, if your mom asked you to clean your room, well, she probably didn't ask you. She's probably suggesting that you do it, but it's really more of a command. So that's an important difference I'll talk about in a little bit when we're talking about indirect commands. But for now, keep in mind the reason it's an indirect question is not because he asked, but it's that why. So he asked why you were sleeping. The why in that is the question word that I'm talking about. That question word replaces an oot or a nay. So when you're asking that indirect question, the linking word in there would be cur, which means why. Not an oot cur or a nay cur, just a cur. Now let's talk about indirect command. This is the same as an indirect statement, except for instead of a he said that, it's a he ordered that. The same way that it was a question, indirect question, to have he asked why, now we have he ordered something or other. So let's take the sentence, he ordered that the troops come home. The order itself is that the troops come home. That is the actual order. However, we're adding a layer that he ordered that. In other words, you're reporting it to someone else. That's an indirect command. An indirect command is going to have some kind of a command word with an oot or a nay if it's the negative. Another important thing to note is that it doesn't necessarily have to be just I ordered. It could, in fact, be I asked. Now, why does that make sense? My mom asked me to clean my room. Well, when your mom asks you to do something, it's not really her asking as much as her telling you that you need to do it. So, when she asked, my mom asked that I clean my room, that would actually not be an indirect question. It would be an indirect command with it. Again, for an indirect command, a way you could tell the difference between an indirect command and an indirect question is that an indirect command is going to have an oot or a nay. An indirect question will always just have a question word. So if you're confused if a sentence is an indirect command or an indirect question, just check to see if it has an oot or a nay. In that case, it is an indirect command. And if none of these above work, so if you've gone through and there's no tom, seek, ita, tantus, if there's no question word and no command word, then you're in a place where it's probably a purpose clause. So if you've gone down that whole list and none of those really work, what I tend to be able to do with a purpose clause is it shows the purpose behind something happening. I went to the store so that I could buy milk. Why did you go to the store? So that I could buy milk. It shows the purpose behind something happening. I think that's pretty self-explanatory. However, there are no real indicators. There's an oot, sure. But besides that, there's nothing really there to make it really a purpose clause that would stand out. So what you're going to be able to do for a purpose clause is if you can put in there for the purpose that instead of in order that or so that. So if you can say, I went to the store for the purpose that I bought milk, that I could buy milk, right? Then it's probably also a purpose clause because it shows a purpose behind it. So that's what I tend to do just to confirm if you're going down that list and it's none of the above. If you can add in for the purpose that, it tends to be a purpose clause. Finally, we have this fear clause. It's really more of an uncommon use of the subjunctive, and it's only set up by a fear word. I fear that I will be eaten by wolves. It's really not something that you have to be too terribly worried about. The only thing to consider and to remember about a fear clause is that it's always the opposite of what you think. So, for example, if you fear that you'll be eaten alive by wolves, and fearing there is just exactly what you would say instead of not fearing, for example. So, I fear that I will be eaten by wolves. You would actually use a nay there instead of an oot. And then if you do not fear that you will be eaten by wolves, you would actually use the oot. So it's the opposite with the oot and the nay, but other than that, fear clauses are just really uncommon and don't worry about them that much. Hopefully this helped you learn the difference between all the types of subjunctives for dependent uses. Again, just go down the flowchart from the top to the bottom and remember those indicators, and that will help.